What emotion do you feel when you're going to approach someone you're very attracted to and there's an extremely high probability that she's going to tell you to disappear? Right, exactly, absolutely, because it's a real judgment, right? We're going to see a movie called Crumb where you'll see this in great detail, but it's a real judgment. It's like the best judgment is, well, I don't mind your physical presence, but your genes should definitely not survive another generation. Right, and that's sort of generally translated into, I think we should just be friends. Right, you know, and you can blow that off, and people do, and you have to, because it's part of being polite and civilized, but you know, let's make no mistake about it. There is no more fundamental judgment than that. So, paralysis. And there's no shortage of men, I mean, who are absolutely terrified of women. I mean, I've had many of them in my practice, you know. I had one guy, he was so terrified of women he couldn't even talk to them on the phone. It's more common than you think. So, but it's generally manifested by men who no one cares about, so it's generally irrelevant. So, well, it's the case. It really is the case. I'm not kidding. They're low status men. You know, they're people that are generally regarded as losers, and there isn't anybody who really gives a damn about what happens to them one way or another, and there's a lot more men in that category than there are women. Women are in all sorts of, you know, social categories that cause them misery and distress, but that one seems to be predominantly male. One of the things I'm going to do when we talk about Freud is I'm going to show you this movie Crumb, which I just told you about, and it's a very rare thing because it shows you the world from the perspective of very intelligent male losers, and that's just not a perspective you ever see, because it's the winners that tell the stories about their life. It's like, who the hell cares about the life of a loser? But this movie is about a loser who became a winner, and you know, almost as an act of revenge, and it's great, great examination of the Oedipal complex. Remarkable. Women select men. That makes them nature, because nature is what selects. And so, you know, you can say, well, it's only symbolic that women are nature. It's like, no, it's not just symbolic. It's not just symbolic. You know, and the woman in some sense is the gatekeeper to is the gatekeeper to reproductive success. And you can't get more like nature than that. In fact, it's the very definition of nature. So, as I said, there are lots of reasons why these symbolic representations are set up the way they are. Alright, so that's the great mother, nature. The queen, the matrix. The matrix is something from which all things form. Same root word as matter, mother, all the same root word. The matriarch, the container, the cornucopia, the object to be fertilized, the source of all things, the fecund, the pregnant. There are more parts of the associational network. The strange, the emotional, the foreigner, the place of return and rest, the deep, the valley, the cleft, the cave, hell, death, and the grave, the moon, ruler of the night and the mysterious dark, and matter and the earth. So those aren't necessarily associated with femininity, but they're typically associated with femininity from a symbolic perspective. You know, so like generally, like a witch in a movie doesn't come riding out of the full bright sun at noon, right? That just doesn't happen because it doesn't make sense. It's a dark thing. And so if you saw that occurring in the light in a movie, you'd think, you know, what the hell's going on here? That doesn't make sense. And the reason it doesn't make sense is because it violates the complex, the symbolic complex. So those are female denizens of the underworld and hell. Very pleasant creatures. It's like Medusa with the head of snakes, you know. And if you ask, you know, why would a woman have a head of snakes in reference to a man? And that's really simple. I bet there are men here who know the answer to that. I don't know what you guys think about this, but I was pretty happy when I thought this up, and it took me a long time. So, if you think about the world in Darwinian terms, right, it's a struggle for survival and reproduction, which are basically the same thing. Survival is you, but reproduction is the survival of your genes. So it's a survival issue over very long spans of time. Okay, what do we call the selection mechanism? Right, natural selection, right? It's nature who does the selection. Okay, so let me tell you something that makes female humans different than female chimps. I mean, there's lots of things that do, but but here's an important one. If you look at which male in a chimp troop fathers most of the offspring, it's the dominant male. But the reason for that isn't because the female chimps sort of flock around the dominant male. Now that happens in other species, but it doesn't happen with chimps. What happens is the dominant male chases all the subordinate males away and will interfere with any sexual behavior they manifest. He'll chase them away. The females, though, are perfectly happy to mate with a subordinate male if they're in heat and they get the opportunity. So they go into heat, which is something that doesn't happen with female humans, and they really don't care who they mate with. Okay, female humans are much different than that. They're picky. So they're choosy. It's a big deal. It's a big deal that they're choosy. Women also seem to evaluate men for their fitness. Now, so lots of men have no sexual partners and they have no children. That's not the case with women. Almost all women have one child or more. And it's a rare woman indeed who cannot find a sexual partner. Some of you undoubtedly have already experienced what it's like to be possessed by a particularly stupid idea. You know, so maybe you've grown out of one or two of the stupid ideas that possessed you, or maybe you're possessed by an attraction to someone you can't control, or you can't control your eating behavior, or you're a pushover when it comes to interpersonal interactions because you're too agreeable, or you fly off the handle and fight, and you know, none of this is really under your control. And so all of those things that manifest themselves not only in your behaviors but in your perceptions themselves, you know, they tend to take on embodied form and use you as the vehicle for their activity. So, you know, when you're thinking about something like anger, for example, think about how it works, because it's quite peculiar. What must someone generally do? How must someone generally act if you're going to be angry at them? They have to be irritating, right? You know, they have to provoke you in some way. Well, the mere fact that you perceive what they're doing as irritating or provoking doesn't ensure that anyone else would have thought about it as irritating or provoking, or that that's what they meant, or that that's what's happening. And my point is, it's very important to think about these complexes of ideas as subpersonalities, because otherwise you really don't get what they're like. If you're angry, if you have a proclivity towards anger, especially if it's an unthinking proclivity, anything that someone says might irritate you. And it isn't like they say something and you think about it and then you get irritated. It's like you perceive the person as irritating. You know, maybe it's just the way they hold their mouth or something. It can be very, very subtle. And you might say, well, it's not me, it's you. It's not that I'm irritated by you, it's that you're irritating. And that, you know, that's a very difficult thing to settle, because the reality is somewhere between the subjective and the objective, right? A lot of arguments that you'll have with people throughout your life are about exactly that. Are you irritating or am I oversensitive? It's like, well, you know, we're going to hash that out for a good long time before we figure it out. But the point is that if you're possessed by an emotional state or a motivational state or an idea or some kind of complex, you'll see the world through its eyes. And then the facts reveal themselves to you through the lens of that particular set of ideas. So it's a very frightening idea, because, you know, we like to think of ourselves as masters of our own house, which is completely clueless, because it's obvious if you watch yourself for like a month that you hardly ever do what you tell yourself to do, and you're liable to do all sorts of other things that you don't even want to do. You know, because you say, well, I'm going to go to the gym 3 times a week and I'm not going to drink, you know, and maybe there's this person I'm not going to associate with, and then, you know, you don't go to the gym and you find that person and you go out and drink with them, and you think, what the hell's going on, you know? But you're not the sort of person that will do what you say. And so, like, what sort of person are you? Well, that's a psychoanalytic question. It's a deep one, because you're a peculiar thing, and there's parts of you that are really, really, really old. And you know, the sort of naive you, the naive young you that you think of yourself as is like a little piece of flotsam in an ocean of complexity, and the ocean of complexity is you. And part of diving down into the depths is to start to understand what it means to be human, and like, whatever that means, it's the one thing you can say about it for sure is that it's bloody peculiar. Sometimes you can come across something new that helps you reconfigure the way that you're living almost instantly in a more comprehensive and fuller way. But more common is the traumatic response, which is when the presuppositions of your world are shifted dramatically and you fall into the surrounding chaos, then it's so hard on you that, you know, it actually does you psychophysiological damage. If someone goes after you at the good person level of analysis and they just demolish you, you know, in the course of, say, a 3-year relationship, hacking away at the idea that you have any moral worth whatsoever, this is what happens when you're abused, then that's going to knock you into pieces at a very complex and high level of abstraction, so that can undermine your entire worldview. If the person instead helps you retool the little behaviors and the little microstructures that make you up, and if you're willing to participate in that, and if you're open to corrective feedback from the world, then you can continually adjust yourself at a small level, and then that makes the things in the hierarchy a little higher, a little healthier, and then that makes the aggregation of those things a little higher in the hierarchy a little healthier and a little more complete. Then you can do this bit by bit retooling without ever having to suffer the demolition of huge chunks of your personality. So let's go back to the relationship where there's a betrayal. It's like virtually every time someone gets flipped upside down because of a betrayal in a relationship, after the betrayal happens, they say to themselves, there were all these signs I didn't pay attention to. So, and maybe the first sign is, who knows, your partner starts to flirt a bit more when you go out on a social occasion. And not a lot more, just a bit more. And you decide, because maybe you're timid, that's okay. You're not going to do anything about it. But it's interesting that it happens. It grabs your attention. And it means something. But what you decide is, it's not worth paying attention to. And so maybe the next 8 times that you go out, the same thing happens, but it happens at a somewhat accelerated rate. And then maybe the person starts to go out without you. And so on. There's this progression towards the end state of betrayal. And every time you get a little hint, the world tells you that something's going on, you put it aside and you fail to take it into account. Well, you're foregoing your opportunity to adjust the relationship at micro stages, because maybe what you should have done the first time that happened is you should have gone home with your partner and said, what the hell's going on? Like, this is what was happening. Why are you doing that? Here's how you should have behaved. And of course that's going to be a fight. There's absolutely no doubt about it. But it might be a micro fight instead of a the relationship is over fight. And in order to keep a relationship healthy, it needs to be retooled at micro levels constantly. And the same is the case with your own character. When you encounter something that's unexpected, especially if it's small enough to handle, you need to extract the information from it, rebuild the world, and rebuild yourself. And then maybe if you continue doing that, every time you get evidence of an anomaly or an error, or every time the world manifests some meaning to you, then you won't have to fall apart, because the structure that constitutes you is going to remain viable and healthy from the bottom up. And if you don't do that, then those errors are going to accumulate, and when they finally do manifest themselves as unavoidable, like when your partner says, I don't want to be with you anymore, or I've been with someone else for the last year, there's no ignoring that, then the whole thing comes crashing down. You're no longer in a relationship, you're no longer in a good relationship, and then all the other things become questionable. So, meaning manifests itself so that you can retool being itself on a continual basis while simultaneously minimizing the risk of total collapse. And morality then becomes the act of paying sufficient attention and reacting sufficiently so that that corrective process occurs. Now, so you're inside one of these. You're going from point A to point B. And as you do that, things you want to have happen, happen. And things you don't want to have happen, and things you don't understand happen. And let's say that you investigate the things that you don't want to have happen, and you investigate the things that you didn't expect. And you do that as soon as they come up. So then what happens? Well, partly what happens is you're going to change your perceptions a bit, and you're going to change your actions a bit, and what that'll culminate in over time is that this whole structural change. So instead of going from point A to point B, maybe you start shifting so that you're going from point A to point C, because as you're gathering information as a consequence of the inadequacies of the way you're looking at the world, not only are you improving your ability to perceive and to act, but you're also gathering information that helps shift your perspective to a better point B, because you might say, well, where are you going and why? And the answer to that is, well, you have a plan. You're going to get your degree. I don't know what your long-term plan is, but there's no reason to assume that your long-term plan is correct, even though there's no reason to assume that you can do without one. So you're in this weird situation where you have to live within a bounded space, and the bounded space is going to produce errors, and it's also going to be wrong. But at the same time, if you use the bounded space, then you can transform it continually across time, even what it's aimed at, and you can minimize the probability of precipitous collapse. If you ask a disagreeable person what he wants, say, or she wants, they'll tell you right away. They know. It's like, this is what I want, and this is how I'm going to get it. But agreeable people, especially if they're really agreeable, are so agreeable that they often don't even know what they want, because they're so accustomed to living for other people and to finding out what other people want and to trying to make them comfortable and so forth, that it's harder for them to find a sense of their own desires as they move through life. And that's not, look, there's situations where that's advantageous, but it's certainly not advantageous if you're going to try to forge yourself a career. That just doesn't work at all. And so even though on average men and women aren't that much different in terms of their levels of agreeableness by the group, if you go out and you look at the extremes, they're very different. So all of the most agreeable people are women, and all of the most disagreeable people are men. And the thing is, the extremes are often what matter rather than what's in the middle. And so one of the ways that's reflected in society, by the way, is there's way more men in prison. And the best personality predictor of being imprisoned is to be low in agreeableness. It makes you callous. Now you might think, well, what's the opposite of compassion and politeness? And the answer to that is, I think it's best sort of conceptualized as a trading game. So let's say that we're going to play repeated trading games. And if you're very agreeable, then you're going to bargain harder on my behalf than you're going to bargain on your own behalf. Whereas if you're very disagreeable, you're going to do the reverse. You're going to think, I'm in this trading game for me, and you're going to take care of your own interests. Where an agreeable person is going to say, no, at best this is, at worst this has to be 50-50, but I'd like to help you every way I can. One of the things you have to be careful of if you're agreeable is not to be exploited, because you'll line up to be exploited. And I think the reason for that is because you're wired to be exploited by infants. And so that just doesn't work so well in that actual world. And one of the things that happens very often in psychotherapy, people come to psychotherapy for multiple reasons, but one of them is they often come because they're too agreeable. And so what they get is so-called assertiveness training, although it's not exactly assertiveness that's being trained. What it is the ability to learn how to negotiate on your own behalf. And one of the things I tell agreeable people, especially if they're conscientious, is say what you think. Tell the truth about what you think. There's going to be things you think that you think are nasty and harsh, and they probably are nasty and harsh, but they're also probably true. And you need to bring those up to the forefront and deliver the message. And it's not straightforward at all, because agreeable people do not like conflict. Not at all. They smooth the water. And you can see why that is in accordance with the hypothesis that I've been putting forward. You don't want conflict around infants. It's too damn dangerous. You don't want fights to break out. You don't want anything to disturb the relative peace. And if you're also more prone to being hurt physically and perhaps emotionally, you also may be loath to engage in the kind of high-intensity conflict that will solve problems in the short term, because it takes a lot of conflict to solve problems in the short term. And if that can spiral up to where it's dangerous, which it can if it gets uncontrolled, it might be safer in the short term to keep the waters smooth and to not delve into those situations where conflict emerges. The problem with that is it's not a very good medium to long-term strategy, right? Because lots of times there are things you have to talk about because they're not going to go away. And the advantage to having a well-socialized disagreeable person is that they really don't let much get in their way. So if you can get a kid who's disagreeable socialized, that person can be quite the creature, you know, because they're very forward-moving in their nature and very difficult to stop. But if you don't get them successfully domesticated, tamed, roughly speaking, by the time they're 4, their peers reject them. And that's a big problem, because your job as a parent is to make your child socially desirable by the age of 4. Like you want to burn that into your brain, because people don't know that. That's your job. And here's why. It's easy if you think about it carefully. So you imagine you've got a 3-year-old child, so sort of halfway through that initial period of socialization, and you take that child out in public. Okay, what do you want for the child? Who cares about you? What do you want from the child? You want the child to be able to interact with other children and adults so that the children are welcoming and smile and want to play with him or her, and so the adults are happy to see the child and treat him or her properly. And if your child's a horrible little monster because you're afraid of disciplining them or you don't know how to do that properly, then what they're going to do is they're going to experience nothing but rejection from other children and false smiles from other parents and adults. And so then you're throwing the child out there into a world where every single face that they see is either hostile or lying. And that's not something that's going to be particularly conducive to the mental health or the well-being of your child. If your child can learn a couple simple rules of behavior, like don't interrupt adults when they're talking too much and pay attention and try not to hit the other kids over the head with the truck any more than is absolutely necessary, then and share and play properly, then when they meet other kids, the kids are going to try out a few little play routines on them, and that's going to go well, and then they're going to go off and socialize each other for the rest of their lives. Because that's what happens, is that from 4 years old onwards, the primary socialization with children takes place among other children. And so if the kids don't get in on that early, they don't move into that developmental spiral upwards and they're left behind. And you can imagine how terrible that is, because a 4-year-old will not play with another 4-year-old who's 2. But a 5-year-old certainly will not play with a 5-year-old who's 2, right? Because the gap is just starting to get unbelievably large. And so the kids start out behind, and then the peers leave them behind, and then those kids are alienated and outside the peer group for the rest of their life. Well, those are the ones that grow up to be long-term antisocial, right? They're already aggressive. It doesn't dip down. Now, what happens to normal boys, roughly speaking? Imagine the aggressive 2-year-old types. They get socialized, so their level of aggression goes down, and then they hit puberty and testosterone kicks in, and bang, levels of aggression go back up. And so that's why males are criminals between the ages roughly of 16 and about 25. So, and it matches the creativity curve, by the way. It's so cool. If you look at the spike of creativity among men, 16 to 25, then it starts to go down. Criminality matches that absolutely perfectly. So that's quite cool. So, and the testosterone levels raise the average level of aggression among men. It's more dominance than aggression, actually, and testosterone is by no means all bad. And then it starts to decrease at about age 25 or 26, which is usually when men stop staying up late at night, stop drinking as much, develop a full-time career, and take on the burdens and responsibilities and opportunities that are associated with a long-term partner and family. And so, well, so that's the development of what I would call predatory aggression, because I also think that the agreeableness distribution is probably something like predatory aggression versus maternal sympathy. It's something like that. So if you look at other mammals that are predators, because we're predators as well as prey animals, if you look at other animals like bears, the male bear has absolutely nothing to do with the raising of the infants. In fact, the female bears will keep the male the hell away because he's likely to kill the infants and maybe even to eat them. So there's no maternality at all in solitary male mammalian predators. It's really useful to investigate the viewpoints of people who have opposing views to yours, because they'll tell you things. Not only will they tell you things you don't know, they'll also tell you how to see the world in ways that you don't see it. And they'll also have skills that you don't have, that you could develop. So for example, if you're an introverted person, it's very useful to watch an extroverted person, because the extroverted person has ways of being in the social world that aren't natural to you, that you can use to improve your toolkit. And if you're disagreeable, one of the best things to do with disagreeable people especially if that's alienating them from other people, for example, because it can. You know, people treat you like you're a selfish, arrogant son of a, maybe that's because you are. It's like, okay, so what do you do about that? One of the most promising treatments, let's say, for that is get the person to do something for someone else once a day, just as a practice, and learn how to do it. Maybe you can wake the circuit up, you know, if you think that it's lying dormant in you, which is probably right. You know, I think we have a very wide range of propensities within us. Some are switched on, genetic propensities. Some are switched on, but I think that if you put yourself in the right situation or walk yourself through the right exercises, you can switch some of these other things on as well. But it takes work and dedication and discipline. I would say, generally speaking, if you want to adapt yourself properly to life, you should find a niche in the environment that corresponds with your temperament. Right? You shouldn't work at cross purposes to your temperament because it's just too damn difficult. But having done that, then you should work on developing the skills and viewpoints that exist in the space opposite to your personality, because that's where you're fundamentally underdeveloped. And that way I think you can extend out your temperamental capability across a wider range. And to me, that's roughly equivalent as bringing a richer toolkit to each situation. You know, so if you're hyper extroverted, you should probably learn to shut up at parties now and then and listen just to see what's going on, to see if you can manage it, you know. And if you're introverted, well, then you should learn how to speak in public and to learn how to go to parties without hiding in the corner and saying nothing to anyone. You know, and if you're agreeable, then you need to learn how to be disagreeable so people can't push you around. And if you're disagreeable, you need to learn how to be agreeable so that you're not an evil son of a bitch. So, and the same thing applies even in the conscientious domain. It's like if you're too conscientious, you need to learn to relax and let go a little bit. And if you're unconscientious, it's time, like, get out the Google Calendar, man, and start scheduling your day, right? And beat yourself on the back of the head with a stick until you're disciplined enough so that you can actually stick to something for some length of time and not living in absolute squalor, which is something that would characterize someone who's very disorderly, for example, because they don't notice. It doesn't bother them, disorder. It's like, maybe they can see it, but it doesn't have any emotional valence, and so it doesn't have any motivational significance. You know, so the other thing you might want to think about too, if you're choosing a partner, is try not to choose someone who's too distant from you on the temperamental variables, because you're going to have a hard time bridging the gap. You know, it's hard for an introverted person and an extroverted person to coexist. And it's really hard for an orderly person and a disorderly person to coexist, because they will drive each other nuts. Why don't you pick up? Why are you so obsessed by it? That's the basic argument, you know. So it's useful to know about your temperament so that you can negotiate the space with your partner as well. And I don't think you should try to find someone who's exactly the same as you, because then you don't have the benefits of the alternative viewpoint. But you got to watch it, because you may hit irreconcilable differences of various sorts. And I've seen that most particularly among couples who are high and low in openness. That's a rough one. And also high and low in conscientiousness. That's another rough one, because they just cannot see how the other person sees the world at all. The route to optimal, the route to quality of life and productivity has been laid out by other people. We kind of know what the parameters are. You need to do something that other people find is useful. And you have to regard it as useful as well. Or at least you have to be entertaining. There has to be something about you of value to other people that you have to pursue with a fair bit of diligence. So you have to play a productive social role. Probably need friends. Probably need an intimate relationship. And if it could be medium to long-term intimate relationship, perhaps all the better. That's what most societies hold up as ideal. You could assume, well, there's probably a reason for that. I think one of the reasons is that your life gets fragmented otherwise, badly fragmented, you know, because every time you have a long-term relationship and it fragments, it's like your identity is blown into pieces. You get fragmented across time. It's not good. It breaks you into pieces, and you don't necessarily recover that well. It makes everything much more impermanent and unreliable, all of those things. So it introduces a tremendous amount of uncertainty into your life, and it also means that you don't have anyone around that you can really trust, and that's bad. Because if you have someone around you can really trust, then you have two brains instead of one, and like you probably need two brains to manage your way through life. It's pretty complicated.
Look, last night, you know, I was at this talk I gave, and about 1,000 people came, and about 500 of them stayed afterwards, and most of them were young men, you know, and just one of them after the other comes up to me, and they shake my hand, and they say, look, I've been listening to what you've been saying for 6 months, and it's changed my life. It's like I was depressed, I was addicted to drugs, my relationships weren't working out, I was hopeless, I didn't have any goal. I started cleaning up my room and telling the truth and working hard on myself, and it's really working, and I just want to thank you for helping me. And I think, God, it's so sad that so many of these men, you know, they've not had an encouraging bloody word, a real encouraging word in their entire life. It just takes a little bit of encouragement and care so that they're willing to set themselves straight to some degree and start trying. It's just a catastrophe that's so rare in their lives.
What's the difference between men and women? Well, how do they differ? Well, the first thing we might observe is that if you look at personality differences between prepubescent boys and girls, they're not very large. Boys and girls don't differ in terms of their trait neuroticism, for example. What happens is that when puberty kicks in, women's trait neuroticism rises, and it stays higher than men for the rest of their life. And this is why you see this reflected in the different kinds of psychopathology that beset the two sexes. So men are overrepresented in alcoholism, drug abuse, antisocial personality, and a host of learning disorders, as well as attention deficit disorder. And women are overrepresented in depression and anxiety, primarily. That seems to be tightly associated with higher levels of trait neuroticism, because maybe it's, if you're at the 95th percentile or higher, let's say, in trait neuroticism, there isn't much difference between that and being somewhat prone to depression and anxiety. And because the curves overlap, you know, the curves aren't identical, the normal distributions aren't identical for men and women. You tilt the one to the right, to the women's curve to the right towards higher levels of neuroticism. You go out and you look for the person in 20 who has the highest levels of negative emotion. It's much more likely to be female than male. Okay, so let's see if we can figure out why. So I'm going to tell you some things, basic differences between men and women, and you can tell me what you think about it if you agree or disagree. Okay, first, size differential emerges between men and women at puberty, right? Because boys and girls are roughly the same size and roughly the same strength, but men get bigger at puberty when the testosterone kicks in, and more importantly, not only do they get taller and heavier, but their upper body strength is much higher. And that's a real issue for combat, because human beings punch. There's other animals that do that. Kangaroos do that too, eh? So we're not the only people that punch, but we have clubs on the ends of our arms. And so that's how we defend ourselves. And so if you have a lot of upper body strength, especially across the shoulders, and you're heavier, then you can step into the punch and it's a lot more devastating. Now, it is the case that if you look at the statistics for physical altercations in marriage, women attack their husbands more often than husbands attack their wives. Well, you think, why is that? Well, let's assume that there isn't any reason other than both people in a relationship can get upset, and the women know that if they hit their husbands, nothing's really going to happen, right? Because if you're if you're a woman about that high and your husband is, say, my height, unless you hit me with an object or something that's sharp, the probability that you're going to do me any serious damage is pretty low. You might hurt me, but if I do the reverse and hit you, and I really hit you, and so the reason, at least one of the reasons why women can be more physically aggressive in minor ways in a relationship is because everyone knows, the wife and the husband equally, that the consequence of the physical aggression is much more limited. So men do more serious damage to women, but women are more aggressive in relationships. So that's interesting. So okay, so there's a body size difference that's important, a strength differential that's important. Next thing, I think, so let's assume that the reason that women are higher in sensitivity to negative emotion is because the world is actually more dangerous to women, right? Because that would be the most logical reason why there would be a sex difference in something like fear or sensitivity to punishment. Well, first, there's the danger of physical altercation. Second, there's the sexual danger. So women become sexually vulnerable at puberty. And why do I say vulnerable? Well, it's straightforward. It's because the cost of sex for women is way higher than it is for men. And it certainly has been throughout our evolutionary history. Because if a man has an unwanted sexual encounter, well, then he walks away and maybe he's persecuted by the state or prosecuted by the state for it. But if a woman has an unwanted, unwarranted, or incautious sexual encounter and she ends up pregnant, then, well, in traditional societies, you're just done. And even in modern societies that are rich like ours, I don't have to go into that. It's big trouble. No matter what you do about it, it's big trouble. So being more nervous about that makes perfect sense. But then here's the last thing. And I think that women's nervous systems are not adapted to women. I think women's nervous systems are adapted to the mother-infant dyad. And because you are not the same creature when you have an infant. Not at all. You're way more vulnerable. And it's partly because you have to express the vulnerability of the infant, and you also have to care for it, right? So you think about an infant, especially under 9 months. So let's say, how are you going to be wired up if you're going to optimally care for an infant under 9 months? And I'm saying under 9 months because women generally do the bulk of childcare for infants who are under 9 months old. And part of the reason for that, there's a whole host of reasons, but part of the reasons for that, obviously, is that they breastfeed. But imagine what you need to be wired up biologically in order to care for an infant. First of all, they're very demanding, right? Because they're completely helpless. And they're demanding 24 hours a day. And it's quite a emotional load. And an infant under 9 months is never wrong, right? What you do to an infant under 9 months is when they're in distress, you always respond. You never tell the infant, get your act together and stop whining, right? Which you can do, say, to a child that's 18 months old. You can start having that sort of conversation. But under 9 months, it's like nothing is the infant's fault. It's surrounded in an extraordinarily threatening world, and you have to be responsive to what it needs, regardless of what you want, and you have to be very sensitive to the threats that emerge in the environment. And so I think the price that women pay for that ability to have an intimate relationship with infants in the very earliest stages of development is that their nervous systems are actually wired so that they can perform that role optimally. And the disadvantage to that is that having a temperament like that doesn't work that well when you're dealing with adult men, especially when you're dealing with them in a business environment, because it's not the same thing. Not at all. It's a competitive environment. So, okay, so agreeable people are compassionate and polite. What are disagreeable people like? They're tough-minded, they're blunt, they're competitive, and they won't do a damn thing they don't want to do. So it isn't exactly that they're aggressive, although they will push you the hell out of their way if you're in the way. They're not like volatile like you are if you're high in neuroticism. It isn't defensive aggression. It's more like predatory aggression. It's dominance behavior. And so for someone who's highly disagreeable, they look at the world as a place in which they can compete and win. And I'll tell you a story. I have a friend. I gave him my personality test, the Big 5 aspect scale that Colin DeYoung developed in my lab. And I knew he was a disagreeable guy, and by interacting with him. I mean, he's even rude to people sort of spontaneously on the street. I actually like him quite a bit. He's very, very funny. He's also very conscientious, so you can trust him, but he's disagreeable as hell. And so I gave him this test because I thought it would be funny, and he came out as the most disagreeable person in 10,000. So reasonable in compassion, about 30th percentile, but like 0.001 in politeness. So he's extraordinarily blunt, and he'll just say absolutely anything, no matter how horrible it is. And he was often brought into corporations to sort of clean them up. So if a corporation was tilting and not doing well, they'd bring him in to find out who the useless people were and fire them. And I talked to him about that because I've had the opportunity to have to not have graduate students in my lab, for example, that weren't performing well, and I find it very, very difficult to, dress someone down, and certainly difficult to fire them. I just hate it because I'm actually quite an agreeable person, much to my chagrin. And I asked him about that, and I said, well, what do? You have to fire people all the time. How do you handle that? He says, handle it? I enjoy it. And I thought, wow, that's so interesting that someone would have that response. I said, well, what do you mean you enjoy it? He said, look, I go into these companies and I analyze the performance of groups of people, right? And in those groups, there are people who are really striving, really trying hard and working themselves really hard and being productive. And then there's these people that are just doing nothing. They're completely in the way. They don't carry their weight at all. They take advantage every chance they get. And they're always whining about why they can't work. It's like, I find out who they are, I call them into my office, and I tell them exactly what they've been doing. It's like, hit the road, buddy. You've had your run of it. And I thought, oh yeah, okay, fair enough. Well, I can tell you, I've had situations in my lab where I had underperforming graduate students. And one of the things that was really awful about that was that it was really hard on the high-performing graduate students, because they felt that even being in the same category as the people who weren't working hard and pulling their weight, devalued what they were doing. You know, and that's exactly right. And so this is also why there's a conscientiousness trait and an agreeableness trait. Because conscientious people judge you on your accomplishments, right? They don't give a damn about your feelings, not a bit. It's like, are you doing the work or not? Whereas agreeable people think, well, you know, your mother's sick, and you know, you've got a bunch of family problems, and we all have to take care of each other, and it's no wonder that you're having a rough time. And like, you can't say that one of those attitudes is correct and the other isn't correct. You can't say that. There wouldn't be those two dimensions if there wasn't something correct about both of them. But you can certainly point out that often they conflict, you know, and so the demand for inclusiveness and unity and care, and the demand for high-level performance in a hierarchical structure, they're very different orientations in the world. And so it's complicated for people who are agreeable and conscientious. And actually, I think often that large corporations and large institutions of any sort run on the unheralded labor of people who are high in agreeableness and high in conscientiousness, and they're disproportionately women. And my experience in large institutions has been that if you want to hire someone to exploit appropriately, no, not appropriately, if you want to hire someone to exploit productively, you hire middle-aged women who are hyper-conscientious and who are agreeable, because they'll do everything. They won't take credit for it, and they won't complain. And that's nasty, and I think that happens all the time. And so one of the things you have to be careful of if you're agreeable is not to be exploited, because you'll line up to be exploited. And I think the reason for that is because you're wired to be exploited by infants. And so that just doesn't work so well in that actual world. And one of the things that happens very often in psychotherapy, you know, people come to psychotherapy for multiple reasons, but one of them is they often come because they're too agreeable. And so what they get is so-called assertiveness training, although it's not exactly assertiveness that's being trained. What it is the ability to learn how to negotiate on your own behalf. And one of the things I tell agreeable people, especially if they're conscientious, is say what you think. Tell the truth about what you think. There's going to be things you think that you think are nasty and harsh, and they probably are nasty and harsh, but they're also probably true. And you need to bring those up to the forefront and deliver the message. And it's not straightforward at all, because agreeable people do not like conflict. Not at all. They smooth the water, you know, and you can see why that is, in accordance with the hypothesis that I've been putting forward. You don't want conflict around infants. It's too damn dangerous. You don't want fights to break out. You don't want anything to disturb the relative peace. You know, and if you're also more prone to being hurt physically and perhaps emotionally, you're also maybe loath to engage in the kind of high-intensity conflict that will solve problems in the short term, because it takes a lot of conflict to solve problems in the short term. And you know, if that can spiral up to where it's dangerous, which it can if it gets uncontrolled, it might be safer in the short term to keep the waters smooth and to not delve into those situations where conflict emerges. The problem with that is it's not a very good medium to long-term strategy, right? Because lots of times there are things you have to talk about because they're not going to go away. And so partly what you do with agreeable people is you get them to figure out, and they have a hard time with this too. If you ask a disagreeable person what he wants, say, or she wants, they'll tell you right away. They know. It's like, this is what I want, and this is how I'm going to get it. But agreeable people, especially if they're really agreeable, are so agreeable that they often don't even know what they want, because they're so accustomed to living for other people and to finding out what other people want and to trying to make them comfortable and so forth, that it's harder for them to find a sense of their own desires as they move through life. And that's not, look, there's situations where that's advantageous, but it's certainly not advantageous if you're going to try to forge yourself a career. That just doesn't work at all.
The hallmark of true sovereignty is the willingness of the elite, let's say the talented, the productive, the blessed, the gifted, to justify the unequal division of talent by serving to ameliorate the catastrophic suffering of the dispossessed. Now, Nietzsche warned about that, right? He thought that Christianity would devolve in some sense into the woke nightmare that it has devolved into. But I think he failed to give the devil his entire due. And the notion that the highest is the highest because it voluntarily serves the lowest, that's a deadly idea. And I don't think it's an ideological idea at all. I think it's an idea that removes the paradox of human existence. And so there's that, but then there's another insistence in both Judaism and Christianity, and I'm not saying it's limited to those doctrines, by the way, that the way to deal with suffering is not to avoid it or to circumvent it with a shallow hedonism, but to face it intensely, head on, and voluntarily in its full manifestation. And so one of the things I've realized about the Passion story, which Jung regarded as an archetypal tragedy and in some sense a limit case, right? A story so tragic that you cannot write a more tragic story.
Right.
Is that it drags the observer, and so that's all of us in Christendom, through the entire catastrophe of human existence, right? So it confronts you with the mob that's after you, that you are also part of. It confronts you with moral relativism in the shape of Pontius Pilate. It confronts you with the oppression of the totalitarian state of foreigners, let's say, in the guise of Rome. It confronts you with the betrayal of your best friend. It confronts you with the willingness of the crowd to punish the virtuous and free the criminal. And that's the story of Barabbas and Christ. And Pajot told me the other day, Jonathan Pajot, that an alternative name for Barabbas was Jesus. And that what the crowd did was pick the political revolutionary over the spiritual leader. And that's perfect. And then it confronts you with the reality that we all face our own mortality, and too early. And the fact that sometimes the innocent and virtuous are punished. And so and then of course there's the horrible, tragic, torturous death, all of that. And that's all signified by the image of the crucifix and what we're doing to ourselves, even though we don't know it. I'm speaking mostly psychologically, although somewhat theologically, is that we're exposing ourselves to the ultimate catastrophe of human existence, while simultaneously manifesting the faith that if we face that unflinchingly, that will resurrect us instead of killing us.
That's quite powerful.
It's something, man. It's something. It's something I've been puzzling out for, a long time, but particularly for the last 6 months. I'm going to write about that in my new book. And when I talk to my audiences about that, and I would especially say this has an impact, again, on demoralized young men, and say, look, we don't know the limits to the expansion of your personality if you're willing to face things without deception. And that's a variant of that radical honesty we were already talking about. Don't live by lies. Well, life is rife with injustice, atrocity, and suffering. And so what do you do with that? Do you avoid it? There's good physiological evidence, by the way, that if you take two groups of people and you subject one group to a stressor involuntarily, and you get the other group to take on the stressor voluntarily, that the pattern of psychophysiological response is entirely different. It's entirely different emotionally, motivationally, and in terms of the damage it does. And so the involuntary imposition of a threat is stressful and damaging, but the voluntary acceptance of a threat is invigorating and revivifying.
Now, it would be nice if we could be optimistic, and I think, again, the problem with being optimistic is that it's naive. So then the question is there an optimism that's not naive? And I think there is. And the optimism that's not naive is in just a visualization of how strong people can be. So one of the things that I tell people, I've told my students in my class, in Maps of Meaning, here's a goal. You want to be the person at the funeral of your father that everyone can rely on. How would that be? You want to be the person who's broken and useless and adding to the misery in the corner. And look, I'm not making light of people's grief. I understand grief. But who do you want to be when there's a crisis? Right? Do you want to be the person that everyone can turn to for strength? It's like, why the hell not? Why not that as a goal? That'd be a good goal, because then if there's a crisis, and there will be, it won't be such a bloody crisis, because there'll be someone there that can deal with it. So when I went and talked to these people at the funeral home, I envisioned that. I thought, okay, well, this is something you have to contend with if you're going to be alive and adult. You have to contend with death and suffering, and you have to be ready for it. And you have to be there for the person, because that's all they're going to have. And so there's a goal, man.
And in this time of nihilism, you know, it's what's the point of life? People ask, and they're taught that at universities. What's the point of life? Everything's interpretation. Humanity's a cancer on the planet. You know, well, how about no? How about not that? How about that there's something to us? If you study the development of the fantasies of very, very dark people, you see that they brood and fantasize in isolation for years. And the fantasies get darker and darker and darker. So they're bitter and resentful to begin with. And then they start fantasizing about, well, what they would want. That can take a sexual end, or it can take a very violent end, or it can take both. And what they're really after is the ultimate in revenge. And on the sexual front, they find a kick in extending the, what would you call it, unacceptability of the fantasy one stage at a time. The famous and extremely attractive sexual serial killer, what was his name? There's a famous photograph of him like this, very attractive man. Do you remember his name?
Ted Bundy.
Anybody? Ted Bundy. Ted Bundy detailed out exactly how his fantasies progressed as he became more and more involved with pornography. And what happens in some sense is that these people who are nursing these terrible fantasies want to stay on the edge of novelty. And so their fantasies get darker and darker and darker as they progress down that road. And so after 1,000 such micro progressions, they end up in exactly the sort of pit that you're describing. And some of that is pure sexual kick because of the novelty. But it's got this sadistic and perverse, vengeful twist. And you could think about it this way. You know, I think it says in the Gospels that, you know, it would be better that a millstone was hung around your neck and that you were cast into the abyss than to do harm to any of God's children, let's say. And that's actually where the perverse delight comes, because the most egregious possible sin, let's say, is the violent sexual abuse of the most innocent possible person. And the perverse novelty kick is highest at exactly that point. And then that just goes from bad to worse. And there's 1,000 or even 10,000 micro decisions that go along with that. There's also a great book called Ordinary Men. This is well worth reading, although it's a bloody catastrophe to read, I'll tell you. It details out how a group of German policemen who were moved to Poland during World War II were transformed from ordinary ordinary working class men, old enough to not have been raised under the Nazi regime, by the way, and so not propagandized into a kind of mindless obedience, how they went from being perfectly ordinary policemen to the sort of people who could take naked pregnant women out into the middle of the field and shoot them in the back of the head. And it isn't like they had an easy time with that. Some of them reported the same sort of thing that you reported when you first watched that video. What they were being called upon to do stage by stage made them physically ill. And they had a commander who actually had told them that they could leave the service if they didn't want to continue with their duties. But they felt duty-bound not to leave their comrades having to mop up the terrible situation. But it does a lovely job of detailing out how your movement from normality to absolute perversity is a consequence of 10,000 micro violations of your own conscience. Not all of them micro, obviously. So you need to know about the vengefulness. You need to know about the kick of sadism. That's that novelty kick that produces a dopaminergic kick that heightens sexual satisfaction. And so there's an element of sadistic misery that can add novelty to sex. That's particularly attractive to people who are bitter and resentful because they actually can't find any willing sexual partners. And so they're angry at the world and shake their fist at God because of it. And so anyways, that's a bit of the developmental course of such a lovely descent into hell. And the interesting thing about it is that people brood, like you don't get to the point where you're watching pornographic videos of children being raped without hundreds or even thousands of hours of increasingly demented voluntary fantasy. And that's that allowing the spirit of sin that would otherwise crouch on your doorstep to enter your house and have its way with you, right? It's like a collaborative venture with Satan himself. That's the most straightforward way of describing it. And so, so that's, I don't know what you have to say about that, but I'll let you have at her.
I'll say this, that everything you're saying absolutely resonates with my anecdotal experiences dealing with these people. I look into their eyes, and what you're describing is what I see, though I've never been able to articulate it like you just have. So I appreciate being armed with an understanding that it will help me uh, evangelize more clearly to others about the dangers of overstimulation and overuse of pornography and shaking hands with the devil. So thank you for that. That was very insightful.
So I spent a bit of time, not a lot, but a bit of time inside a maximum security prison when I was a kid. I worked with a very strange psychologist that was there. And one of the things that really shocked me, and I think this shocked me enough to change my whole life, was I met this one prisoner who was a pretty nondescript looking character. He took me for a walk out in the yard away from a gym full of like weightlifting, axe murderer, monsters, and rapists. And we went for a walk out in the yard, and the psychologist called us back and told me later in the office that this guy, who was about 5'2", pretty non-prepossessing guy, had made two policemen kneel in front of him, beg for their lives in reference to their families, and then shot them both in the back of the head and kicked them aside. And the shocking thing to me was, you kind of think that if you met pure evil, it would have a monstrous form. And the thing that shocked me about that was the nondescript nature of this guy. His absolutely banal ordinariness, the fact that you could just walk past him on the street and you'd never know. He wasn't some monster, the monstrous character of Satan in your imagination is, a figure that's terrifying to behold instead of someone normal. You know what I mean? Normal in that cringing sense. These people that you've interacted with, like, what's your reaction to them when you talk to them, the pedophiles, when you talk to them and when you arrest them?
My experience is very similar to what you just described. Very nondescript, people of all walks of life. We've arrested and I've interrogated educators, lawyers, law enforcement, clergymen, and sitting across from them. But with no apparent physicality that would tell you who they are. But I will say this: when they start talking and I look into their eyes, that's when I sense something that really scares the hell out of me. And the way they talk about children when they get there, and it's something that they've been able to normalize. And they're speaking to me about children almost like they're talking about, the weather, or, talking about buying and selling children like you talk about buying and selling computer parts or an automobile or something. And that's where I thought something has taken over you. Something non-human has made you less human. And I've never been able to figure it out, only that it creeps me out. And I usually end up getting them to confess because they have brought themselves to a place where they think they're okay. They think that it's somehow normal. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, how do
to
they,
you, Dr. Peterson? Why?
Well, the degree of rationalization that has to, with each step forward in the progress of the fantasy, there has to be a step forward in the self-deception with regards to self-description, right? So imagine that you're attempting to cling to a sense of yourself at least as normal, but even maybe as a moral agent. I mean, the more forthright pedophiles claim that they're only allowing children to express their true sexual desires, and that what they're actually doing is forming the best relationship with the children that they've ever had. Now, of course, there's part of them that knows that that's an absolutely bloody, screaming, hellish lie. But you get to that lie, like I said, with 1,000 micro lies, right? And you're modifying your self-conception along the way. I mean, have you had these people justify themselves to you? And if so, by what means do they attempt to do that?
So one person that comes to mind, absolutely, the answer is yes. And one person that comes to mind is the person depicted in the film Oshensky. This person had written articles, self-published, of course. He had a book that he actually sold on Amazon. And his understanding, or his justification, was that the puritanical society of this country has crushed the true and beautiful and righteous sexual experience, which the most natural would be between a man and a child, a prepubescent child. A prepubescent child is the most beautiful form of humanity, and why take that away from a child? Children would be well conditioned to confront the challenges of life if only they could experience orgasmic pleasure even in their prepubescence. This is how they talk.
Right.
And this is
Well,
how-
yeah,
and they-
well, that you saw echoes of that. There was attempts made in the 1970s by French intellectuals, surprise, surprise, to have the age of consent reduced radically. And that was always the rationale. It was an extension of the patriarchal oppression theory in some sense, right? That all sexual expression is essentially pure and good in its most fundamental form. And it's all warped by social pressure. And if we were just allowed to express ourselves in every manner that we saw fit, then everyone would be free and we wouldn't suffer anymore from the constraints of tyrannical society, right? And it's just convenient for the bloody pedophiles that happens to justify them doing whatever the hell they want to children who are obviously too young to consent.
If you're obsessed by memories of the past, more than 18 months old, and most of those are negative, so anxiety provoking most often, then there's a lot of you that's stuck in the past. And what that means is you didn't map the territory well enough, and the parts of your brain that are alarm systems, anxiety systems, are saying, no, there's holes in the way you're looking at the world. There's holes in the way that you're looking in the world. And you fell in them once, and you don't know where they are, and you don't know how to fill them, and you don't know how to walk around them, and so you can't forget them, you can't forget them, you can't forget them, you can't forget them. So you have recurring nightmares, for example, are a good example of that sort of thing happening. But in any case, if you have memories like that, you remember them, they make you feel anxious and negative, you're stuck back there. Your body is still reacting as if there's an emergency that could happen again that you haven't fixed. And it doesn't matter if it was your fault. That's irrelevant because the alarm system doesn't care. Like when your smoke detector goes off, it isn't relevant whether it was your fault. The smoke detector just says house is on fire, and that's a bad thing. And your anxiety systems are like that. If they're tagging old memories with anxiety, then you have to do something about it, or you will be tortured by those memories forever, because that's how the alarm system works. And so maybe you need to go back there and clean things up. You got to figure out, okay, well, how did this happen? What sort of role did I play? Even if it's a minor role, that doesn't matter, because the point is that you don't want to be put in the same vulnerable position again. So anything you can do to strengthen yourself is good. You know, and often if it's a really old memory, like maybe you were a child, you're not a child now, so you probably have a variety of techniques at hand that you could use to deal with a situation like that if it came up now. And so you have to update that part of your brain that still thinks you're 4. And lots of people have parts of them that are still stuck in some traumatic childhood experience. And they don't. I had a friend like that who had a terrible childhood, and I mean really, I've had clients with terrible childhoods, and his was like top of the lobster hierarchy in terms of terrible childhoods. And whenever he had a dream about it, which was very often, he was 5 in his dream. Well, he's 58. You know, he's not 5, but hadn't been updated, and so he was still 5 in his dreams. It was a complete bloody nightmares for him, complete with all sorts of terrible physiological symptoms, really hurting his life. He couldn't get himself updated, and he's much older in his dreams now, by the way. He's up to about 45, so which is way better than 5, you know, because you can't fight back when you're 5, but you can fight back when you're 45, especially if you have some, you know, some experience at your disposal. So anyways, you need to know where you are. So let's say where you are is, well, you're on this stage, and you're on this side of the stage, and you decide that you're going to go over to that side of the stage, just to show that you can. And you're making the decision, the same decision that, you know, the famous chicken who is going to cross the road. Why does the chicken cross the road? Well, if it's a sensible chicken, it's because it assumes that there's something better on the other side of the road. It's like, or maybe it's random curiosity, but then it just gets picked off by a dingo or a coyote, so that's not so good. The other side of the road is better, so away the chicken goes. So that's what you're doing. You're going somewhere slightly better. And so that's good. Technically, it's good. Because the way that your positive emotion systems work, they run on a neurochemical called dopamine, which, by the way, is the neurochemical system that drugs like cocaine and methamphetamine and alcohol for some people and opiates affect dramatically and make people feel far better than they should, which is part of their danger. It's a very fundamental system. The dopamine system kicks in with a kick of positive emotion if you're going somewhere that's worth going. And so that's worth knowing. It's really worth knowing. It's like, okay, you want a little bit of positivity in your life. Well, how do you get it? Well, you've got to get the system. It's almost it's the left hemisphere system for most people. Not that that's particularly relevant, but it is a standalone neurochemical system. It's rooted very, very deeply in the brain's exploratory circuitry. So very ancient system. And it's happy when you have somewhere to go. That's the first thing. And then it's also happy when you're going there. And so if I'm on this side of the stage and I want to go over to that side of the stage and I see that there's a nice clear pathway, I could just go straight down this line, then I look at that and I'm actually a little happy. I'm not ecstatic. I mean, who the hell cares if I get to the other side of the stage, right? I mean, it's a small piece of my life, but it's not nothing. It's something. Okay, and so I look at the pathway and I think that's a good pathway and I feel a little positive. And then if I move here and then I see that little table right in the way between me and the other side of the stage, then I feel a little negative because I don't want an obstacle in my pathway. And so that's really how you're looking at the world, by the way. You don't see objects. It's not the right way to think about it. We don't see objects and then think about them and then evaluate them and then decide how to act on them. Or if we do it rarely and slowly and with a lot of thought. What we see instead are pathways with tools that will move us forward or obstacles, right? And there's no obstacles here and there's a nice flat road and so great. Positive emotion. This is a task I can undertake. The sailing is clear. It's a good day. And then I'm here and it's like, yeah, well, that's a little annoying. I get a little pang of disappointment, let's say, anxiety. Can I make it around that obstacle? I'm fairly confident. I've done this sort of thing before. So I can take the rough route and I can, walk forward like this and then I can do this great trick, which is just this. And then, I've circumvented the obstacle. Now, if I didn't know how to do the little bit of circumvention, then that would be a real problem, right? Because I couldn't get from point A to B and that would screw up my plan. But I do have that particular skill set, so it's a minor disruption to the perceptual set that I'm using to organize the world. It's a minor bit of chaos, because that's what happens when your perceptual set, the structure that you're using to organize the world, the plan through which you're viewing the complexity of the world, reveals an inadequacy, then that destabilizes your emotions. So that's another thing to know. One thing you need to know is you need to be going somewhere and there needs to be a pathway in order for you to feel good. The other thing to know is that if that plan is untenable or becomes destabilized, then what happens is you become flooded with negative emotion. Frustration, disappointment, anger, primarily anxiety. But all of those things sort of intermingled. Anger maybe because you have to fight your way through the obstacle. Frustration because maybe you have to make a new plan. Disappointment because you put a bunch of work into the damn plan and it didn't work out. Anxiety because now there's too many choices in front of you. And so people don't like to have their plans disrupted. They don't like to have their plans disrupted. And the reason for that is that their plans are directly associated with their emotional perception of the world. And so, that's a good thing to know too. That's why, what it is you've decided that you're going to go to like a Korean restaurant for dinner, and that's fine, and then it turns out that you can't, and maybe you have to go to a Greek restaurant, and it's like, who cares, right? Unless you hate Greek restaurants. Korean restaurant, that's pretty good. Greek restaurant, that's pretty good. You're still going to be annoyed that your plans changed. Well, why? Well, because it's annoying to have your plans changed. It disrupts the structure that you use to stabilize your perceptions of the world. And it throws you momentarily into a state of chaos. Not much. Now, how much chaos? This is interesting. We don't know, like, let's say you wake up one morning and you have an ache in your side. It's like, well, you don't have an ache in your side. What does it mean that you have an ache in your side? Well, you don't know. Like, maybe it means you pulled a muscle, and like, who the hell cares? Maybe it means you have cancer, and like, you're going to be dead in 6 months. The whole range of possibility is there, you know, and some people will assume one thing, it's like, that's nothing, and some people will assume the other, and all of them will be right sometime. And so the question is, how do you calibrate something like that? And the answer is, well, we tend to guess at it. We guess at it temperamentally. So one way we guess at it is we have our set points for negative emotion. So it's neuroticism trait. Some people will be a lot more nervous about a small level anomaly than others. And maybe they'll go to the hospital first and they won't die. And then, or maybe they'll be freaking out all the time and they'll be a hypochondriac, right? So there's pros and cons about being nervous like that. The other person's very emotionally stable. They don't worry about much. They think, it's nothing. And then, you know, by the time they get to the hospital, it's too late. Hey, that's how the dice roll. That's one way that you guess. It's determined in large part genetically. Not completely, but in large part. Another part is your position in the hierarchy. You know, so the issue is, well, how safe are you in life? And the answer is, who knows? But one of the way you guess is, well, are you good at things? You know, because if you're good at things and a problem comes up, you can probably solve it. And then you might think, well, how do you know if you're good at things? And one answer might be, well, other people think you're good at things. Because you're really kind of comparing yourself to other people when you're thinking about whether or not you're good at things. And so if it turns out that you're in a hierarchy and you're fairly high in the hierarchy, indicating a certain degree of competence, then your nervous system, under the control of the serotonin system, dampens down your negative emotion. It says, look, you know, all things considered, you're probably pretty safe. And that's nice, but it also means you don't like having your position in the dominance hierarchy challenged at all. Because if you get tossed down the hierarchy, let's say you get fired, well, wreaks havoc with your serotonergic function. It makes you defeated, like the defeated lobsters that I wrote about. And then all of a sudden, you're way more susceptible to negative emotion. And who wants that? And so that's why you don't even like to lose arguments. You know, you lose a little argument, it's like, whoop, down the dominance hierarchy a bit, up, emotions are a bit destabilized. It's no damn way, I'm right. And why? Because I want to keep my neurochemistry in check. And no wonder. Well, the thing is, sometimes it's better to learn than to insist upon being right, because learning works better for the future. But you get the point.
Victim, which is a painful role to have. Because something bad happened to you to be a victim. But it's something that society struggles with. What about people who feel like they're a victim?
They're right. They're victimizers too. Like, everybody is a strange mixture of victim and victimizer. Lots of terrible things happen to people that aren't justifiable in some sense. You know, well, illness strikes people randomly. I mean, not entirely randomly, obviously, but there's a large random element in it. Where you're thrown into existence as a consequence of your birth. That's existentialists, especially in the 1950s, talked about that all the time. They talked about it as thrownness, that you're sort of thrown into reality with your particular set of predispositions and weaknesses. And then there's going to be times in your life where things twist in a manner that's unfair to you, that you're not getting your just desserts. But that goes along with all sorts of unequally distributed privileges as well. And so that's the arbitrary nature of existence. But you can't allow those sorts of things to define you, because it's not that useful strategically. When you're playing a card game, you're dealt a hand of cards. Well, what do? You play the hand the best you can. Why? Because all the hands are equal? No. Because you don't have a better strategy than playing the hand that you're dealt the best you can. And that doesn't even mean it'll be a winning strategy. But because people don't always win, sometimes we lose, and sometimes we lose painfully, and sometimes we lose painfully and unjustly. That's not the point. The point is, you don't have a better strategy, and neither does anyone else. And then it's also not so obvious how privilege and victimization are distributed. You know, if you take someone who's doing quite well in life and you scratch underneath the surface, you generally don't have to scratch very far until you find one or more profound tragedies of the past, or perhaps of the present. You know, and no matter how well protected you are in the world, you're still subject to illness, you're still subject to aging, you're still subject to the dissolution of your relationships, the death of your dreams, death itself. So vulnerability is built into the structure of existence. Now, if you start to regard yourself as a hapless victim, or even worse, an unfairly victimized victim, well, then things go very badly sideways for you. It's not a good strategy. You end up resentful, you end up angry, you end up vengeful, you end up hostile. And that's just the beginning. Things can get far more out of hand than that. So strategically, it's a bad game. It's better to take responsibility for the hand that you've been dealt. There's no better, you've got no better protection in life than doing.
You know, if you take people, then you expose them voluntarily to things that they are avoiding and are afraid of, you know, that they know they need to overcome in order to meet their goals, their self-defined goals. If you can teach people to stand up in the face of the things they're afraid of, they get stronger. And you don't know what the upper limits to that are, because you might ask yourself, like, if for 10 years, if you didn't avoid doing what you knew you needed to do, what would you be like? Well, you know, there are remarkable people who come into the world from time to time, and there are people who do find out over decades-long periods what they could be like if they were who they were, if they spoke their being forward. And they get stronger and stronger and stronger, and we don't know the limits to that. We do not know the limits to that. Probably running at about 51% of our capacity. Something, I mean, you can think about this yourselves. I often ask undergraduates how many hours a day you waste, or how many hours a week you waste. And the classic answer is something like 4 to 6 hours a day. You know, inefficient studying, watching things on YouTube that not only do you not want to watch, that you don't even care about, that make you feel horrible about watching after you're done. That's probably 4 hours right there. You know, you think, well, that's 25 hours a week, it's 100 hours a month, that's 2.5 full work weeks, it's half a year of work weeks per year. And so if your life isn't everything it could be, you could ask yourself, well, what would happen if you just stopped wasting the opportunities that are in front of you? You'd be, who knows how much more efficient? 10 times more efficient, 20 times more efficient. That's the Pareto distribution. You have no idea how efficient people get. It's completely, it's off the charts. It's not so obvious to me that people would take the meaningful path. You know, when you say, well, nihilists suffer dreadfully because there's no meaning in their life, and they still suffer. Yeah, but the advantage is they have no responsibility. So that's the payoff, and I actually think that's the motivation. Say, well, I can't help being nihilistic. All my belief systems have collapsed. It's like, yeah, maybe. Maybe you've just allowed them to collapse because it's a hell of a lot easier than acting them out. And the price you pay is some meaningless suffering, but you can always whine about that and people will feel sorry for you. If you live a pathological life, you pathologize your society. And if enough people do that, then it's hell. Really, really.
One of the things that you can, I think this heightens the meaning in your life, is to try to do difficult things, right? Aim high. Don't aim so damn high you can't manage it, and make sure you break down your aims into reasonably attainable sub-goals, but you want to aim high, and then you want to see how hyper-efficient you can get. That's a great thing to do in your early 20s, is to see, okay, like, discipline yourself. Think, okay, how much work can I do if I load myself right to the maximum? How far can I work? How hard can I work until I exhaust myself? And then you back off, obviously, because the optimal amount of working, productive engagement, let's say, is that which is sustainable across decades. So you have to learn that, but you don't learn that without stretching yourself to your limits to begin with. And, you know, if your life isn't everything it could be, and if you're suffering from an excess of meaninglessness, well, it means you're not oriented in the world of chaos and order properly. It's like you could learn to discipline yourself. Look, figure out what it is that you need to do and that you want to do, and then see how efficient you can get. Because one of the things that's quite fun is to figure out, if you have a task, I always tell my graduate students this if they're doing an experiment too. If you have a task that you have to do, it's really interesting to spend a few minutes, sometimes hours, depending on how long the task is. See if you can figure out how to do it from 5 to 10 times faster. It means you'll have to rearrange the way you think about it, but you can often do it. And that's how extremely productive people get so hyper efficient.
If you're suffering you are obligated, in a sense, to hold on to whatever rope someone throws you. Life can be meaningful enough to justify its suffering. You can tyrannize yourself into doing things, but I wouldn't recommend it. What I would recommend it instead is that you ask yourself what you're willing to do. It's a really effective technique. It's like a meditative technique. That's when life is worthwhile. I don't know exactly what's going to help you, but don't arbitrarily throw out any possibilities because you might not have that luxury. Antidepressants help a lot of people, and there are technical reasons why that's the case. If you're offered a gift by your society and it works, try it. I don't care what your presuppositions are. The time you see people who are suffering with depression, for example, there's a multitude of reasons, but I'll take one common reason. You could think about it as associated with the story of Peter Pan. Peter Pan is someone who won't grow up, right? Now, the problem with Peter Pan is he gets to be king, but it's king of Neverland. Neverland doesn't exist. So being king of nothing isn't that helpful. Well, one of the things that you often see with people who suffer from depression, and I'm not making a blanket statement about the cause of depression because there's lots of them, is that people who don't have enough order in their life tend to get overwhelmed. So, for example, if someone comes into me to see me and they say they're depressed, I always ask them a very standard set of questions. Do you have a job? If you don't have a job, you're really in trouble in our society. First of all, your biological rhythms tend to go off the rails right away because there's no reason to go to bed at any particular time and there's no reason to get up. And for many people, if they don't get up at the same time, they foul up the functioning of their circadian rhythms, and that's enough to make them depressed right off the bat, especially if they start napping during the afternoon. They also don't have a purpose. People aren't good without a purpose, and this isn't hypothesizing. We absolutely understand the circuitry that underlies positive emotion. When you're attending to something you're interested in and you're engaged in it, that's when you're alive. That's when life is worthwhile. It's so worthwhile that in those moments you don't even ask the question about it. The question itself goes away because the meaning that you're united with is so powerful that it can push back the adversity that would otherwise characterize life. Nietzsche said, the person who has a why can bear any how. We know how it works. Almost all the positive emotion that any of you are likely to experience in your life will not be a consequence of attaining things. It will be a consequence of seeing that things are working as you proceed towards a goal you value. That's completely different. And you need to know this because people are often stunned, for example. They finish their PhD thesis and their presupposition is that they're going to be elated for a month. And often instead they're actually depressed. And they think, oh, what the hell, I've been working on this for 7 years and I handed it in and what do I do now? And that's what depresses them, right? It's the what do I do now? Well, they're fine if they enjoyed it pursuing the thing. As long as it was working out, they get a lot of enthusiasm and excitement out of that because that's how our nervous systems work. Most of your positive emotion is goal pursuit emotion. If you take drugs like cocaine or amphetamine, the reason they're enjoyable is because they turn on the systems that help you pursue goals. That's why people like them. So if you don't have a job, you got no structure, that's not good. Plus, you tend not to have a point. So you're overwhelmed by chaotic lack of structure and you don't have any positive emotion.
So that's an interesting thing. Well, so let's say you go over your past with a fine-tooth comb and you decide you're going to take responsibility for everything that you did that was wrong and everything that you failed to do that you could have done that was right. It's like, does that change the world? It's like, depends on how thoroughly you do it. You might say it changes the world like nothing else possibly can. And I think that that's actually right. You have to allow yourself a certain latitude for error. And that's a useful thing to know too. One of the things I tell people when they're trying to develop a vision for their life or an implementable plan is make a bad plan. Like, make the best one you can, but don't get obsessive about it. It's like, make a plan, implement it. You'll figure out when you implement it why it's stupid, exactly, and then you can fix it a little bit.
So imagine you have a goal in mind. You want to get to work in the morning. I used to ask my students a question like this, is like, what? Maybe they're going to write an essay. Why are you writing the essay? Why are you in class? Well, I'm in class because I need this class because it's part of my major. Well, why did you pick a major like that? Well, I'm interested in psychology. Well, why did you come to get a degree? Well,
I think I need a degree to get a job. Well, why do you need a job? Well, I need a job to keep body and soul together, and maybe to be productive, and maybe to, establish a name for myself. And why do you want to do that? Well, because, it's part and parcel of living properly. And why do you want to live properly? And well then, and how would you live if you lived properly? And at that point, people are usually unable to answer. Because you can just push people with questions about why until they run out of explanations. But the point is that you're always doing whatever you're doing because what you're doing is nested in a sequence of goal-directed actions. And those can be more or less sophisticated. If you're not very sophisticated at all, the nesting might be like 2 structures deep. Maybe you're, you're bored and you want to go get drunk, and why? Well, because you don't want to be bored. And if someone pushes you a little farther than that, you hit them. And, you don't want to delve into it. But if you're sophisticated, you have a pretty good hierarchy of answers. So you might say, well, why do you want to be a productive and generous citizen? And like I said, people usually bottom out there. But you could say, well, that's part of reciprocal altruism. And if I'm productive and generous, then that'll encourage other people to be productive and generous. And if we're all productive and generous together, then there'll be more for everyone, and we'll all get along better, and we'll get along for a longer period of time, and that'll make us all more stable, and that'll make our societies better. And then you might say, well, why is that relevant? You might say, well, because the alternative to that is something like a descent into something approximating hell, and so that's part of a reflection of the divine order and the eternal battle between good and evil. And then you could push it farther than that, and you could say, well, are you going to be on the side of the redemptive hero, or are you going to be on the side of the eternal adversary? Like, you can keep digging down farther and farther, and the farther down you dig, the more you get down into what you might describe as the implicit religious substrate. And it's very much useful to know that and to make as much of that conscious as possible. So now imagine that you've come to this talk tonight because you've decided to aim up. And maybe you haven't formulated that precisely explicitly, but something is driving you in this direction. And then you come to the talk and you find out that I'm talking about something that isn't what you expected, and it doesn't seem to be moving you along on your pathway forward to that end. And what's going to happen is you're going to be disappointed. And you might be anxious too. You're going to be disappointed because disappointment signals that you're experiencing something that's not relevant to the goal that you are attempting to pursue, and that might in fact be interfering with it. That's what negative emotion does. And maybe if you're disappointed in what I say, that also makes you anxious because you assumed that you would come here and I would say something relevant, because you assumed that you knew who I was, and then it turned out that I didn't, and then you don't know who I am, and then you don't know what you're doing here, and then you get anxious. And the reason you get anxious is because that's what anxiety is for. It tells you when the pathway to your goal has been disrupted, so multiple pathways have now emerged. So imagine you're driving your car to work and it quits. And what happens is you get anxious. And the reason you get anxious is because, well, you were beetling along quite nicely in your world, and everything was reduced to like a unidimensional simplicity. You weren't in a car as an object, you were in a thing that took you to where you wanted to go, and it was just doing what it was supposed to be doing, tracking you along the pathway to your goal. And then it fails and you're off on the side of the road, and you get anxious because how the hell are you going to get to work? And what if you don't get to work? And is your boss not going to be very happy with you? And maybe this is the 3rd mistake you've made this week. And what if you get fired? And weren't you an idiot for buying this car? Maybe you shouldn't have a car at all. Maybe you should have walked to work. And maybe you should take a bicycle, because after all, that would save the planet. And and maybe now you have to take your car to a mechanic, but the last time you went to the mechanic, you got ripped off because you're too stupid about vehicles to manage one, and you're kind of stupid about technology in general. And aren't you stupid? And maybe you're too stupid, and isn't your wife going to? That's anxiety, right? And that's the emergence of a multiplicity of pathways, right? And so what anxiety signifies is the degeneration of a an attentional hierarchy into multiplicity. And the reason you get anxious and it feels bad is because now your body can't compute how much energy you have to put out in order to get to your goal. And so you can't organize the world. You're apt to use more resources than you'll replenish. And if you continue to do that, then you'll die. And so anxiety is a signal that complexity has reemerged, chaos. That's the eternal dragon of chaos. Chaos has reemerged because your narrative has collapsed. And so that's negative emotion. That's what negative emotion signifies, is that it's the collapse of an organizing narrative. And so that's very interesting to know. So you feel positive. If I walk on the stage and I know I'm supposed to go to the front of the stage, say, and the reason I want to do that is because I know I have to talk to you, and that's and I want to talk to you because I think it's valuable to talk to you, etc. That's nested in a hierarchy of value. And if I see a clear pathway to the front of the stage, then that actually produces positive emotion. And that positive emotion impels me forward, because positive emotion does impel you forward. That's what it's for. That's how positive emotion is linked to action. So if you're enthusiastic because you can see a pathway forward to a valued goal, and that enthusiasm manifests itself. This is true even neurochemically. It manifests itself as positive motivation to move forward. And not only that, if you're moving forward and it's working, your brain tracks the fact that it's working, and then that's linked to dopamine release, by the way, which is what cocaine releases. It's linked to dopamine release. And the other thing your brain is doing, even when you're just walking to where you want to go, if you're successfully walking there, your brain tracks what you're doing. There's circuits that are activated while you're doing it. And if what you're doing results in the result you desired, then the dopamine floods those little neurons that are active, and it makes them grow and flourish. And so as you practice something that's working, the circuit that is activated as you're practicing is bathed in dopamine, and that makes it stronger. And that feels good. It's growth. It's part of positive emotion. And so the positive emotion moves you forward, but also encourages you to develop a habit of that practice. And so one of the things I would bloody well say is, don't make a habit of pursuing things that aren't good for you, because you build that into you. That's what happens if you become addicted to something, you know. You build a little monster inside you that's grown, it's there, it's after one goal, despite everything else. Not a good outcome. So now positive emotion also signals the fact that it's also an energy conservation observation. So as I move forward towards my goal, with each step I take, it's going to take less energy to get to the goal. And so that means that positive emotion signifies, what would you say? It signifies the increasing efficiency of your action as you move towards a goal. So negative emotion signifies the fact that things have got too complex for you to manage, and positive emotion signifies that you're approaching your goal and becoming, and that there's less demand on energy output with every step forward. And so that's emotion. And that's pretty much worth knowing. And then what happens when you're watching a movie is you infer the goal of the protagonist, or the villain for that matter. You infer the goal of the character that's being portrayed on the screen. You adopt that goal as your own. Then you play out the emotions in your own body, which mimics the structure what would you call the character that's being portrayed on the screen, and you live that all out inside you. And that's also how you understand other people, right? You don't listen to someone and then figure out what they're saying and then infer what they're thinking. That isn't how it works. What you do is you listen to someone till you figure out what they're up to. As soon as you figure out what they're up to, you can adopt that frame of reference. As soon as you adopt that frame of reference, you have the same emotions. And that's what makes you united. And so that's so interesting. And so then you think, look, there's 5,000 people in here. If there were 5,000 chimpanzees, you guys would be tearing each other into shreds, because no one would be able to know what anyone else was up to. But because all of you are here paying attention to the same thing in the same way, you have virtually identical emotional states, and that means instantly your behavior is rendered predictable to one another. And there's no difference between that and peace. They're the same thing. And so what that means is that one of the predicates of a civil, productive, and peaceful society is that everyone inhabits the same narrative. And you might say, well, we don't need the same narrative. It's like, yes, we do, because if we inhabit a different narrative, then we're running emotionally in different directions, and we will not understand each other, and we will run into conflict, and that conflict can become deadly at the drop of a hat. And so it's a precondition for a civil society that everyone is united in the same narrative. And then that begs the question, right? What is the narrative insofar as we're unified? And another question, which is, what should the narrative be? Right? Now, the postmodernists figured out that we looked at the world through a story, but they said their mantra is they became skeptical of meta-narratives, which are uniting narratives. And that's all well and good to be skeptical about meta-narratives, but you run into the problem of internal disunion. Because if you don't have a uniting narrative, then you're divided against yourself, and you run into the problem of social disunity, because if we're not looking at the same thing for the same reason, then we can't get along. And those are big problems. Now, the way the postmodernists glided over that immense cataclysmic problem was to offer the proposition that the narrative that unites us is just one of power and oppression, right? And that the fundamental motivation that guides, first of all, even your internal organization, your own internal tyranny, you know, you're oppressing your id or your natural self. And then if you establish a relationship with someone like a marriage, well, that's just a manifestation of patriarchal oppression. And if you organize a business relationship, it's a relationship of mutual exploitation, and so far and so on, all the way up the political hierarchy, all the way back into the past. A more dismal view of human existence couldn't possibly be formulated. And I always think about it as a kind of implicit confession. It's like, so you think the world's all run by power, do you? Okay, I know what game you're playing and attempting to justify, and it's completely bloody preposterous, because first of all, if you tyrannize yourself, you're going to be one miserable creature. Plus, you're going to rebel constantly, as you already know. I'm sure all of you have tried at one time or another in your life to force yourself to do something with a whip, so to speak, and what you instantly find is that you're so condemned to be free that you'll even resist your own tyranny, right? Try telling yourself to do something and see if you do it. I'm going to go to the gym. That's New Year's. I'm going to the gym 3 times a week, 2 hours a day. It's like, no, you're not. You're going to last like 3 days. And then you're going to find an excuse. The rebellious part of you is going to find an excuse, then you're not going to do it. And it's a bloody mystery, isn't it? Because you'd think you could tell yourself what to do. Because otherwise, who are you? You know? You're the part that told yourself what to do, but you don't listen, so what the hell's that part? That's you, that's for sure. So you can't even tyrannize yourself with any efficiency. And then if you're married, men, you're married, try tyrannizing your wife and see how well that works. And like, it might work for 10 minutes, but she's not as big as you, but she's a lot sneakier. And you have to wake up with her tomorrow morning. And so even if you do win the fight, which you won't, she's going to bloody well take it out on you the next day, and no wonder. And so you're bound in that relationship by the necessity of continual iterative interactions, right? And they have to be
moderately peaceful, or you're going to tear each other into shreds. And if it's constant conflict, you're both going to just exhaust yourself and die. So how the hell is that going to work? So it has to be at least mutually reinforcing. And maybe if you really got it together well, you could interact with each other in a way that improved your interactions across time. And maybe you're wise enough so that if you were on that track, the way you would experience that in the moment would be as exactly the kind of relationship you'd want to have with someone. And that would be something like the spirit of play and romantic love. And that would be the manifestation of an instinct that orients you across time properly in a relationship in the moment. And that's such a wonderful thing to know, right? That instinct for play and romantic love might be the voice of the wisest instinct you have, the deepest orientation to meaning that you have. You know, because there's nothing more delightful in a marriage or in a family, if you have children, than to be able to engage in something like voluntary play. And you know, if you could have the world set up the way you would want it to, if you had any sense, wouldn't it be something if mostly what you did was something akin to play? And that's equivalent. Christ in the Gospel says, know that unless you become like a little child, you'll never enter the kingdom of heaven. And what does that mean? It means to rediscover that intense immersion in life and that capacity for play that characterized us all as children, that we can't maintain because we have to mature, but that we could rediscover as adults if we were sufficiently wise and careful. And so, and then, you know, if you have friends, it's like, well, you tyrannize your friends? Well, then you don't have friends. You're just a bully with henchmen. And as soon as you stumble, they're going to stab you in the back because you surrounded yourself with craven psychopaths. They're just going to wait for the moment to take you out. That's not a friendship, obviously. And if you're running a business, and those of you who've run businesses who have a clue know this is true, it's like, what happens if you rip off your customers? Well, you can get away with it once or twice, but word gets around in no time flat, and then you're just done and bitter and resentful because your idiot machinations didn't work. But if you engage in fair trade and you're reliable and you deliver what you promised and you're half decently good to your employees and the people that you work for, then they're going to be pleased with you, and they're going to come back and they're going to talk to their friends about how well you did, and you're going to flourish. And none of that's arbitrary. You know, that's all guided by the manifestation of a certain form of attentional priority, right? You go to your customer's house, maybe you're a plumber, and the first thing you do is you listen to their damn problem. And so at least you have enough sense to engage in dialogos, right? You actually want to hear what the problem is, and then you actually want to solve it. And if you do that with some diligence, they're going to be pleased with you because they don't want sewage all over the rug. And so your interests are aligned, and if you offer what you promise, then you're going to evoke positive emotion in them and quell their anxiety, and that's exactly the service that you're offering. And so that means you're acting out the proper story. You're productive and generous and honest, and there's nothing arbitrary about that as a ethos that unites you internally and that also makes it possible for you to exist in a peaceful and productive society.
If you're resentful about something, well, first of all, you should notice, I'm resentful. And that's kind of humiliating because no one's proud of being resentful. It's a shameful emotion. Well, so then why are you resentful? Well, there's only two reasons as far as I've been able to tell. One is that you're allowing yourself to be taken advantage of, or you're being taken advantage of. Sometimes you're not allowing yourself. Sometimes you're a child being abused by their uncle. You're not allowing yourself. You can't do anything about it. You're resentful because you're being taken advantage of, or because you're immature. It's one of those two things. Figure out which it is, and then take the steps necessary to address it. Living a life without resentment is a great goal. People are often resentful if they see that responsibility has been abdicated. Why isn't that person doing their job? It's like, well, hey man, step in at your workplace, in your family. You know, and you think, well, I shouldn't have to do that extra work. Well, you shouldn't be a slave. You shouldn't allow yourself to be tyrannized. But if something bugs you because a responsibility is going unfulfilled, there's a great opportunity for you. And this is something I don't think we teach young people well. And one of the things, you may remember this, that was so striking about the tour was that
I made a case fairly consistently that most people find the meaning that sustains them through the vicissitudes of life, not in happiness, but in responsibility. And that would bring everyone to a halt. It would always make the whole theater silent. It's like, oh, I never thought of that connection. Because maybe you want to avoid responsibility, and you can understand why. You can understand why. You hide from it. That is what you encounter if you go out in the world and you think, who the hell wants that? I don't want the responsibility. It's like, well, yes, you do, as it turns out. There's nothing better than responsibility. Now, you know, I say that with some caution. I think that it's hard to say. The responsibility, I've been overwhelmed by my apparent responsibility, but I think it's also kept me alive. And I mean that literally. And so,
wait, can you go a little deeper with that? I mean, when you were at your darkest moments in the last 2 years, whatever that might be, was it the feeling
there's been many times in the last year where it would have been much easier for me just to be dead. That's constant. So, but no.
But is it but no because of something in you, or is it but no because of the people that you would have abdicated that responsibility of the people, or is that ultimately the same thing? Yeah.
Well, I do think the two aren't easily distinguishable, but it's definitely that. It's definitely that. You know. And it's one of the chapters, the last chapter, is be grateful in spite of your suffering. You know, you need a meaning to sustain you through suffering, and it is the case that you find that in responsibility. Well. And so it's good advice for anyone who's at work. You're resentful about this and that because people aren't pulling their weight. Pull it. See what happens. You become indispensable instantly. You'll know everything. And maybe that job won't be for you, or maybe that relationship won't be for you, but you'll take your hard acquired wisdom and go elsewhere and flourish there. So, you know, this kid stopped me. I think I wrote about this in this book. Kid stopped me in a restaurant one day when I was walking in, and he said, and he had an undergraduate degree, and he was working as a waiter in a chain steak place. And he stopped me and he said, you know, about 6 months ago, I was watching one of your lectures and I decided to stop being resentful about my job. And he was resentful because he had a university degree and he's working as a waiter. You know, and look, I don't have anything against waiters. It's like a waiter can make your evening, you know, hooray. He said, well, I decided I'd start trying at my job, like really trying, as if it was worthwhile. He said he got 3 promotions in 6 months, like he's just rocketing up the power hierarchy. Well, it's not power, it's competence, if it's well run. You know, and places are full of opportunity.
There's always people out there who are doing far better than you on pretty much anything you want to imagine. And if all you're doing is seeing yourself in their reflected light, let's say, then it's going to be pretty damn dismal. But it's not a good comparison because, well, first of all, there's danger in just comparing yourself to others, period, because they're not you. And God only knows what struggles they had to undertake to get to where they were, or what burdens they're currently carrying that you're not aware of. But you can certainly contrast yourself with yourself. And that's a lot better. It is the only way. Well, it's also the only way of really measuring anything approximating proper improvement. You can actually tell when you're a little better than you were yesterday.
Right.
And you can actually do that. That's another thing that's so interesting about it, is that you can actually make yourself a little better in some way, pretty much, well, I don't know if it's at every moment, but you can certainly do it every day. Let's say you want to become who you could be in the fullest sense. So let's say you're someone who's going to solve some serious problems. Okay, the first thing you have to do is admit to the seriousness of the problems. That's no joke. And so the first thing is just the terror of the problem itself. And that's enough to paralyze you. And that's the Hydra, that's the Gorgon with the head of snakes. It'll paralyze and turn you to stone. That's the basilisk in the Harry Potter series. Mm-hmm. You look at it and it turns you to stone and lurks underneath everything, right? And it's malevolence and tragedy. And so there's that. And then the next is, well, you're going to take responsibility for that? You're really going to do that, are you? That's a hell of a load, man. And so it's daunting to even consider that. And then there's the discipline and responsibility that necessitates, which is also daunting. It's like, oh my God, the problem's that serious. I'm really going to have to get my act together in order to not contribute to it, much less solve it. And so the problem is terrible. And then the
the solution is daunting. But the upside of that is like, well, there isn't anything better to have than a problem that's worth solving, like that's really worth solving, right? And so the more of that you take on, the more you have a reason to get out of bed in the morning, no matter what. Like, I'm getting up, I'm trudging forward. Doesn't matter what I'm suffering from, I've got things that need to be done. They're necessary. And that gives you that sense of purpose that is the antidote to bitterness. Okay, well, let's say you want your life to be meaningful. It's like, okay, then what you do matters. It actually matters. Or how starting to clean up the room changed their life. That's quite fun because it's something I always tell people to do instead of going out and protesting. Jesus, I just can't stand
Cleaning up
that.
the room?
Yeah.
Meaning?
Well, my sense is that if you want to change the world, you start from yourself and work outward because you build your competence that way. It's like, I don't know how you can go out and protest the structure of the entire economic system if you can't keep your room organized. Well, I made a video call, which was called Message to Millennials, where it was called How to Change the World Properly. A bit of on the pretentious side, I suppose, but I was trying to produce something that was a counterposition to this idea that what you should do is go out and fix up other people. You know, that's just not right. There's a New Testament line about that, something about, you know, not worrying too much about the log in your neighbor's eye, or about the speck in your neighbor's eye when you have a log in your eye. What would the world be like if people stopped avoiding the things they knew they should do? You know, because the question is, how much are we contributing to the fact that life is an existential catastrophe and a tragedy? How much is our own corruption contributing to that? That's a really worthwhile question. The things you leave undone because you're angry, you're resentful, you're lazy, you have inertia. Well, you consult your conscience and it says, well, you know, that place over there could use a little work. It's the same as working on yourself, and so you clean that up because you can. And then things are a little clearer around you. And you're a little better off because you've practiced a bit. And so you're a little stronger, and then something else manifests itself and says, well, maybe you could like take a crack at fixing me up too. So you decide to do that. And then that gets a little bit more pristine, you know, and soon, and it's humble because you're not exceeding your domain of competence. You know, it's like, don't be fixing up the economy, 18-year-olds. You don't know anything about the economy. It's a massive, complex machine beyond anyone's understanding, and you mess with it at your peril. So, and can you even clean up your own room? No. Well, you should think about that. You should think about that. That's that willingness to gaze into the abyss, which is obviously what you were doing when you went to Ukraine. It's like, it's gazing into the abyss that makes you better. The thing is, and this is maybe where Nietzsche's idea is not as differentiated as it became. Sometimes your gaze can be forcefully directed towards the abyss, and then you're traumatized. If it's involuntary and accidental, it can kill you. The more it's voluntary, the more transformative it is. And that's part of that idea about facing death and hell. It's like, can you tolerate death and hell? And the answer is, this terrible answer is, yes, to the degree that you're willing to do it voluntarily. And then you might ask, well, why should I have to subject myself to death and hell? I'm innocent. And then the answer to that is, even the innocent must be voluntarily sacrificed to the highest good.
That's such an interesting distinction. Voluntary suffering.
Voluntary, yeah. Yeah. Well, that's why the central Christian doctrine is pick up your cross and follow me. And I'm speaking not in religious terms saying that. I'm just speaking as a psychologist. It's like one of the things we've learned in the last 100 years is voluntary exposure to that which freezes and terrifies you in measured proportions is curative. The first thing I do as a clinician, if someone comes to me and says they're depressed, is ask myself a question. Well, what does this person mean by that? So I have to find out, like, because maybe they're not depressed, maybe they're hyper anxious, or maybe they're obsessional. Like, there's various forms of
powerful negative emotion. So they need to be differentiated. But then the next question you have to ask is, well, are you depressed, or do you have a terrible life? Or is it some combination of the two? So if you're depressed, as far as I can tell, you don't have a terrible life. You have friends, you have family, you have an intimate relationship, you have a job or a career. You're about as educated as you should be given your intelligence. Use your time outside of work wisely. You're not beholden to alcohol or other temptations. You're engaged in the community in some fundamental sense, and all that's working. Now, if you have all that and you're feeling really awful, you're either ill or you're depressed. And so then sometimes there's a biochemical route to that, treatment of that. My experience has been as a clinician is if you're depressed, but you have a life and you take an antidepressant, it will probably help you a lot. Now, maybe you're not depressed, exactly. You just have a terrible life. What does that look like? You have no relationship. Your family's a mess. You've got no friends. You've got no plan. You've got no job. You use your time outside of work not only badly, but destructively. You have a drug or alcohol habit or some other vice, pornography addiction. You are completely unengaged in the surrounding community. You have no scaffolding whatsoever to support you in your current mode of being or you move forward. And then as a therapist, well, you do two things. Well, if it's depression per se, well, like I said, there's sometimes a biochemical route, a nutritional route. There's ways that can be addressed. It's probably physiological if you're, at least in part, if you're depressed but you have an okay life. Sometimes it's conceptual. You can turn to dreams, sometimes to help people, because dreams contain the seeds of the potential future. And if your person is a real good dreamer and you can analyze dreams, that can be really helpful. But that seems to be only true for more creative people. And for the people who just have a terrible life, it's like, okay, you have a terrible life. Well, let's pick a front. How about you need a friend, like one sort of friend? Do you know how to shake hands and introduce yourself? I'll have the person show me. So let's do it for a sec. So it's like this. Hi, I'm Jordan. And people don't know how to do that. And then they can't even get the ball rolling.
For the listener, Jordan just gave me a firm handshake.
Yeah, as opposed to a dead fish. You know, and there's these elementary social skills that hypothetically, if you were well cared for, you learned when you were like 3. Yeah. And sometimes people have, I had lots of clients to whom no one ever paid any attention. And they needed like 10,000 hours of attention. And some of that was just listening, because they had 10,000 hours of conversations they never had with anyone. And they were all tangled up in their head. And they had to just, one client in particular, I worked with this person for 15 years. And what she wanted from me was for me just to shut the hell up for 50 minutes, which was very hard for me. And to just tell me what had happened to her. And then what happened at the end of the conversation, then I could discuss a bit with her. And then as we progressed through the years, the amount of time that we spent in discussion increased in proportion in the sessions, until by the time we stopped seeing each other, when my clinical practice collapsed, we were talking about 80% of the time. But she'd never been attended to properly, ever. And so she was an uncarved block in the Taoist sense, right? She hadn't been subjected to those flaming swords that separated the wheat from the chaff. And so you can do that in therapy. If you're listening and you're depressed, I would say, if you can't find a therapist, and that's getting harder and harder, because it's actually become illegal to be a therapist now, because you have to agree with your clients, which is a terrible thing to do with them. Just like it's terrible just to arbitrarily oppose them. You could do the self-authoring program online, because it helps you write an autobiography. And so if you have memories that are more than 18 months old that bother you when you think them up, part of you is locked inside that. An undeveloped part of you is still trapped in that. That's a metaphorical way of thinking about it. That's why it still has emotional significance.
So you can write about your past experiences, but I would say wait for at least 18 months if something bad has happened to you, because otherwise you just hurt yourself again by encountering it. You can bring yourself up to date with an autobiography. There's an analysis of faults and virtues, that's the present authoring, and then there's a guided writing exercise that helps you make a future plan. That's young men who do that, could go to college, young men who do that, 90 minutes, just the future authoring, 90 minutes, they're 50% less likely to drop out. That's all it takes. Like I had clients who were so depressed they literally couldn't get out of bed. So what's their first step? It's like, can you sit up once today? No. Can you prop yourself up on your elbows once today? Like you scale back the dragon till you find one that's conquerable, that moves you forward. There's a rubric for life. Scale back the dragons till you find one conquerable, and it'll give you a little bit of gold, commensurate with the struggle. But the plus side of that, because you think that, God, that's depressing. You mean I have to start by sitting up? Well, you do if you can't sit up. But the plus side of that is it's the Pareto distribution issue, is that aggregates exponentially increase. And failures do too, by the way, but aggregates exponentially increase. So once you start the ball rolling, it can get zipping along pretty good. This person that I talked about was incapable of sitting with me in a cafe when we first met, just talking, even though I was her therapist. But by the end, she was doing stand-up comedy. So, it took years, but still, most people won't do stand-up comedy. That's quite the bloody achievement. She would read her poetry on stage too. So for someone who was petrified into paralysis by social anxiety and who had to start very small, it was a hell of an accomplishment.